Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we cultivate tomorrow by inspiring agripreneurs and ag innovators through real-life perspectives in agriculture. I'm Paul Windemuller, your host on this journey of exploration and growth. All right, so today's episode is a solo episode. Sorry, you just have to hear me speak. I just wanted to do a wrap-up. I am in the UK right now. I'm sitting in a hotel in London recording this, and just at the end of my UK journey, I will be heading to Amsterdam later on today. And it's been about a week I've been in the UK traveling around. So I'm going to go through my journey of the visits that I had here and also some of the things that I learned along the way, some of the observations that I had. Whether they're right or wrong, we'll find out. But there's a few people that had entered on our social media pages, some questions, some things they wanted me to bring up. So I'm going to address those as I go through today's episode as well.
Hey everyone, before we get started with today's episode, I just wanted to take a second to thank our sponsors, Bank Barn. I love these guys and what they're doing to streamline banking and agriculture. They're helping to connect farmers and lenders so that today's farmers have more options no matter the size of operation. Check out bankbarn.io to learn more.
So starting out, I'll give you a little overview of my travels here. I started out in London, flew in, had a couple of meetings right away in London. As many of you probably know, London is kind of the financial hub of Europe, one of the financial hubs of Europe. So what I was meeting with people in London about was large investment funds that fund agricultural investment around the world. Had a couple of meetings with, I think there was 2 meetings that I had with investment funds here that specialize only in agricultural investments. One in the local, well, not local, but in the New Zealand market specifically, and the other one is more of a global player that has investments in many areas of the world. So I was talking with them about how they raise capital, why large institutions and large wealthy families would be interested in investing in land in different parts of the world and agricultural enterprises in different parts of the world, and also what type of investment that they're looking at, whether that be forestry or specialty crops or livestock enterprises, those type of things. I also talked to them about the risks of being a large investment fund. You know, what areas of the world that they've invested in that things haven't gone very well, maybe because of political risk or environmental risk, policy changes that have happened that changed their investment drastically. So that was really interesting, getting to understand that world of agricultural finance and agricultural capital markets. And then after I spent a few hours in London running around, seeing Buckingham Palace, Westminster Abbey, and Big Ben, you know, some of those type of sites, enjoyed that. I really enjoy history, so it was really interesting being in the UK this week and seeing things that are, 700 to 1,000 years old that you read about in history books, and I got to experience those. So that was really a neat aspect for me personally. So once I left London, I headed to southeast England to Dorset County. And that is where Sophie Gregory, who's been on our podcast a couple of times, you can check out those episodes if you want to find out more about her enterprise and her farm. And we spent a couple of days going around visiting farms. She set up some farm visits for me. So thanks, Sophie, for doing that. We went to a robotic rotary dairy that was a confinement system, where all the cows are housed indoors, much like my system back home, and talk to the family there that owns that and how they manage that versus what they used to do, where it was mostly grazing. We spent a couple of hours at a farm that I did a social media post on that does vending machine milk vending machines. They have a business doing that, and they have a robotic grazing dairy. And so we spent some time there. It was really interesting to see how they use technology and using a grazing system with robots. It's more common in Ireland. You see that in Ireland. I did not see a whole lot of that here in England. I think he was one of a few that has done that successfully. And the couple that owns that farm does do really well with milk production. They're an organic dairy, so they can't use any commercial fertilizer for fertilizing their pastures. And they have to feed a pellet through the robot to the cows as they come in to get milked. And that's also organic feed as well. So at that farm, we had an interesting discussion between Sophie, the farm owner, and myself about the sustainability initiatives that are being put on farmers in the UK, mostly by their processors, and what really drives sustainability, true sustainability. And it was a discussion between grazing systems and housed confinement systems. And it was also part of that was from previous visit that we had to the robot dairy, the rotary robot dairy that was confined housing system, and how they were able to go from a grazing system to a confined system and really fine tune a lot of the management aspects to be able to manage the cows more consistently, because they're not depending as much on the weather, and their feed was more consistent, and the environment that the cows were in were more consistent. So that was interesting to have a little bit of a talk about that. I'll be talking more about that on future podcasts, but that was an insight that we had quite a bit of discussion on as we went around. I enjoyed getting to move some cows with Sophie at her farm. We moved them from one pasture to another and came over a hill and just a beautiful view of a valley. She's got a beautiful farm, great place. Really enjoyed being there and meeting her family. Her husband, Tom, got to meet him and talk to him about some of the things that he's doing with their cropping side of their business, organic cropping. And then we had the pleasure of spending a half a day. We drove over to the Southwest Dairy Agri Center and met up with a fellow scholar, Annie Williams, who had visited me back in June at my farm. And she was able to set up this meeting at this Southwest Dairy Agri Center farm. And it was a really interesting setup. So the Agri Center is 50% government funding and 50% funding from 250 member companies that are involved in dairy. And this farm was used to demo on a commercial scale new technology and new feed additives, things like that. So some of the technology that we were able to watch and look at was automated feeding system that was installed in the barn. And they had a hoof bath system with cameras on it that when the cows stepped out of the hoof bath, would take pictures of each individual hoof, and it would identify any lesions or start to any issues that cows would have on their hoofs. Another system that the cows walked through a laneway, and it was over top of that, take a picture of the cow and would be able to see how the cow walks. So we call it locomotion scoring, and also the body condition of the cows. So it could see if the cow is losing condition, gaining too much condition, and all this data would be aggregated together to watch and monitor cow performance. They have a specialized beehive that collects some of the pollen that's on the bees that come in, so they can see, and then they sample those pollens to figure out what plants those came off of. So then they can see what plants are in the area and how many plants are in the area, different varieties. So I thought that was kind of an interesting beehive to measure biodiversity. Also, while we were at this farm, we had a discussion about the EU deforestation regulations that's supposed to be coming on, I believe, January 1st of 2025, which is a regulation that you must prove that your ingredients, and they're talking mostly protein like soybean meal and fats like palm kernel, would be sourced from areas that were not being deforested. So what they were saying was this could have a big impact on the supply of different feed ingredients that are necessary for maximizing cow performance in the UK and in Europe, where the prices of the ingredients that are coming in are going to be much higher because there's going to be less supply that's going to be able to come to this market. So that's a big concern that especially dairy producers have right now in the country. And a lot of them don't even know about it yet. So that's something that we're going to keep an eye on and understand what the impacts of that could be on the global milk market. That could be interesting to watch. So after I left Sophie's farm, I went north up toward the area of Chester, and then that's right on the border of Wales and England, and got to spend a day in Wales with another friend of mine who's a Nuffield Scholar, Ethan Roberts, and he took me around to his hometown, which is called Ruthin in Wales, and it's a beautiful spot. We sat up on a very, very large hill overlooking the town and the valley, and he was pointing out where everything was, where he grew up and the farm that he's farmed at before, and some of the other neighbors of his, what they do, and where the cattle yard is. And it was a great way to see the city before we went into it, so I could have some context. And then we spent a few hours going through a few dairy farms that were in the area. Enjoyed that. Those are mostly confinement systems. They weren't doing a lot of grazing. The ones that we went to, there's a few on the outskirts of the valley that were doing grazing. And then we got to go to the livestock auction sale barn. I really enjoyed that. I love going to the sale barn and buying cattle. That's one thing that is probably considered a hobby of mine. But this was a very, very nice sale barn, and they have sales there almost every day of the week. They're selling sheep and cattle, and when we were there, they had a sheep show going on of the Welsh breed of sheep. They were having a big show there, so that was interesting to watch for a few minutes. Then we took a ride up into the higher elevation, and where Ivan's family's farm is on the side of kind of a mountain and higher elevation. It was a beautiful area. Spent the night there. And then the next day, I went to Sam Watson-Jones' farm, who's a fellow Nuffield Scholar and a past guest as well of the AgCulture Podcast. Got to see his arable farm. They run some feed beans and wheat and barley and oats, and got to see their grain setup. They also have a pretty large poultry operation there that we got to see. One of the empty coops, we couldn't go inside the ones with the birds in them for biosecurity reasons, but we got to see one of the empty ones, and really enjoyed getting to see his operation. He was not available, so I spent a few hours with his parents going around the farm, which was really interesting, and got to hear some stories about Sam. The next, I went to a farm that's owned by the Duke of Westminster, probably one of the largest farms in England. I think they milked right around 2,700 cows, a confinement operation, again, a rotary parlor, very, very nice farm. Everything was spotless. The cows were in really, really good condition, very top-notch operation. We got to talk to one of the main operators there at that farm, and who is also a Nuffield Scholar from a few years back, and talk to them about what they're working on for sustainability initiatives. And one of the big things that they're going to be doing shortly is putting a digester in that farm, and also looking at expanding with robotic operation. They also have a unique side business that is quite popular called Cogent, and that's a genetics business. They have very high genetic cattle. Again, as I mentioned, their cattle looked great, and they leveraged that by using their genetics and selling those all over the world. So that was really interesting to hear that aspect of their business. So on this farm, they're using a lot of different technology to monitor cattle performance and make decisions for cattle care. These also help them with the genetics business to monitor and have bigger data sets to prove out their genetics. And then wrapping up my trip, I went to the Midlands of England and stayed with Tom Rawson and got to see his dairy. He is the vice chair for Nuffield UK, has a couple of different dairy farms that he owns, and then a few more that he's also involved in the management of, and took me around to some of those farms. Got to understand a little bit more about some of the different systems of business structure that are involved in dairy in the UK. That was one thing that I found very different here. I think I've talked about it on a past podcast. Actually, the one with Sophie, we touched on it a little bit. A lot of people get into dairy here through a contract milking agreement, much like New Zealand, or a tenancy lease. So they'll take on a farm that maybe was owned or is still owned by an estate or a private landowner and do a 10, 15, 20-year agreement to farm there. And I found it really interesting because I didn't see a lot of, other than a couple of privately owned farms, on a lot of the tenancy farms and contract milking farms, there wasn't much capitalization, or what I mean by capitalization is investment in new infrastructure, much that was really apparent. Most of the stuff that I saw probably hadn't had much capital investment in it for the last 20 years. So it was interesting to see, in my mind, I'm thinking how viable these farms are going to be in the future if they're not going to be reinvested in. And you're seeing that a lot in the UK, just much like the US. Farms are going out at a very rapid rate of going out of business, and they're not being filled back up. So yeah, the concept of contract milking and tenancy farming was something that took me a little bit to get my head around the pros and the cons for that. I think it's a way that you can get into the industry much more readily, but it also can kind of hamstring you a little bit in your business, because who's going to pay for the capital expenses that need to be improved upon in order to stay competitive over time? So that was an interesting concept. And then on my way back to London, I got to stop in at Hannah Flower's farm, her arable organic farm that her and her husband Alex have. Hannah and her husband Alex are both doctors, and I had the pleasure of having Hannah on my Global Focus program tour that I did back in March and April for 6 weeks, traveling around the world in my Nuffield group. So it was great to catch up with her for a little bit, have a cup of coffee and a walk around her farm. We had a discussion about the subsidies that are being put in place. There's a lot of changes with the subsidies going on in the UK right now, more geared toward farm practices that show biodiversity and what's called rewilding. So taking marginal ground out of production and then planting it back into trees or shrubs or some sort of native species of plant and not farming it. So there's a lot of that going on right now. Hannah was replanting some of their pastures with some different varieties that they did not have in them to help with the biodiversity factor, and they were getting paid quite a bit to do that. That was probably, the numbers that she gave me were roughly the same numbers that most people said was their net profit per acre per year on arable ground. So that right there was doubling, in some instances, doubling the income per acre that farmers were realizing. So there's a real big push toward biodiversity, getting marginal ground out of production, and getting marginal ground out of production. So my thoughts on that would be interesting to see in the future how much they're risking food security at the expense of some of these initiatives. It's not bad to care about the environment and want to do a better job and not really use marginal ground and leave that be, but also what's that going to do long term to the farmer's appetite for actually producing food? I think that'll be a interesting topic of discussion for another episode. So that's the wrap up on the UK trip. I hit most of the questions that the audience has asked on the social media pages. One other one I'll go through here is from Dwayne Martin. He was interested to see how different small farms are adapting to future-proof their operations with rising costs of operations. And Dwayne, I think that what I saw here in the UK is those are the farms that are really looking into these sustainability initiatives with the subsidy programs and leveraging and maximizing those subsidies, as well as having other businesses, having an Airbnb on their farm, having a farm shop, and the vending machine farm, as I mentioned earlier, being able to service multiple vending machines with their milk from their farm. I think in the UK here, it's really apparent that if those small farms are going to be successful, they need to leverage the interest by the consumers to be involved in the operation, whether that be through a store or through some sort of experience with camping or direct market product. So that's really how most of the farms that I saw that were being successful on a small scale were operating. Another farm that I saw was a trout farm. That was not a very large farm, didn't take up much space, but they were raising trout. And I know we have this back in the US too. I've seen it before, but they were raising trout to send off to other ponds and lakes where they were parks that people charged an admission fee to go and fish in, which is kind of a different concept than the US, but there's not a lot of wild fish here in the rivers and lakes. So they've got to get stocked by these farms. So this was a farming operation that raised trout to put in other ponds and lakes and got paid to do it. So that was a pretty small scale farm, but they created a lot of value out of that small area, and 1 to 2 people worked that. So those are a few examples of what I've seen here in the UK. All right, well, I'm going to wrap up for now. I've really enjoyed being in the UK. I got to see 7 different Nuffield Scholars while I was here, and thanks to all of them for allowing me to stay with them, see their daily lives. It's just interesting to go see how other people live in a different country, so I enjoyed that. So now I'm on to the Netherlands. I'll be flying over to Amsterdam tonight, and I will be checking out a lot of different tech companies in the Netherlands, as well as some farms. So looking forward to that, and stay tuned. I'll be releasing an episode probably another week or 2 about that experience as well. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Sorry, it was just me talking, but I thought it would be a great idea to give a little bit of a video journal of my trip here in the UK. So until next week, I'm Paul Windemuller, and this has been the AgCulture Podcast. Thanks for listening.